Fascism didn't rise on fear alone. It rose on jobs, debt, and a promise that the state would fix everything. When people think of fascism, they picture armies marching, flags waving, and speeches echoing through crowded squares. But beneath the theater, the real machinery wasn't military, it was economic. Dictators didn't just control the people with guns. They controlled them with payrolls. This is the story of how fascist leaders discovered that the easiest way to buy obedience wasn't through terror, but through employment, and how an entire generation, desperate for security, sold its freedom for a paycheck. The stage was set by disaster. In the 1920s, Europe was exhausted. The Great War had drained treasuries, destroyed industries, and shattered currencies. In Germany, hyperinflation turned savings into wallpaper. In Italy, returning soldiers found no jobs, no pensions, and no purpose. Democracies were young, fragile, and broke. Then came 1929, the crash that finished what the war had started. Unemployment across Europe soared above 30%. Farmers starved while cities burned coal. They could no longer afford. In Berlin, people sold their furniture for food. In Rome, families stood in bread lines that stretched across plazas once built for emperors. And in the vacuum of chaos, a new kind of politician emerged. Not promising liberty, but order. Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco didn't rise because people wanted dictators. They rose because people wanted stability. Each man offered the same deal: surrender political freedom in exchange for economic security. They understood something democracies hadn't, that when money fails, ideology becomes currency. When Hitler took power in 1933, Germany was on its knees. 6 million unemployed, industrial output halved, foreign investors gone. But within 3 years, unemployment had nearly vanished. The German miracle had begun. To the outside world, it looked like genius. To the people, it felt like salvation. The Nazi regime was giving out jobs, building highways, factories, stadiums, even a new affordable car, the Volkswagen. The radio called it rebirth. But behind the illusion was an economic sleight of hand, so audacious that it changed history. The Nazis didn't find money. They invented it. Through a system of secret promissory notes called Mefo Bills, they created billions in off-the-books credit, IOUs disguised as industrial contracts. Instead of borrowing from banks, the state forced companies to accept these notes as payment, promising to redeem them later, once Germany was strong again. It was economic magic: full employment without visible debt, prosperity without accounting. Factories roared back to life, workers cheered, and the numbers, at least on paper, were miraculous. But it wasn't productivity that fueled the recovery, it was militarization. Every new job was tied, directly or indirectly, to war. The autobahns doubled as military transport routes. The factories making Volkswagens could switch to tanks in weeks. The jobs miracle was simply a rearmament program wrapped in national pride. The genius of the system was psychological. People didn't feel oppressed, they felt employed. They weren't coerced into loyalty, they were paid for it. And when your paycheck depends on the state, freedom becomes negotiable. Across the Alps, Mussolini was playing his own version of the same game. In Italy, the Duce didn't just promise jobs, he promised unity. After years of strikes, class conflict, and socialist unrest, Mussolini offered a third way between capitalism and communism. He called it the corporate state, a system where workers, employers, and the government would supposedly cooperate for the national good. On paper, it sounded balanced. In practice, it was control. The regime replaced free trade unions with state-run syndicates. Wages and prices were fixed. Private companies technically remained private, but only as long as they obeyed. Every industry reported to the fascist party. Every contract passed through its bureaucrats. Propaganda sold efficiency as virtue. Mussolini made the trains run on time, people said. It became a global cliché, proof that fascism worked. But the numbers told another story. Productivity stagnated, imports soared, debt ballooned. Mussolini's public works programs, draining swamps, building monuments, creating jobs, cost far more than the country could afford. To maintain the illusion of success, the regime manipulated statistics and borrowed relentlessly from foreign creditors. Italy's miracle wasn't growth. It was branding. Like a corporation faking profits for investors, the fascist state inflated its image until the cracks could no longer be hidden. In Spain, Franco watched and learned. After a brutal civil war, his new regime promised self-sufficiency. Spain, he declared, would rely on no one. an economic autarky. The idea sounded patriotic. In practice, it was catastrophic. Spain sealed itself off from trade, nationalized industries, and rationed everything from food to fuel. State-owned enterprises became the lifeline of survival. To get a job, a loan, or even a house, you needed loyalty, not skill. The black market became the only real market. Productivity collapsed. Famine followed. Yet Franco stayed in power for nearly 4 decades. Because even when the economy failed, the loyalty mechanism worked. People learned to equate obedience with stability. The regime had turned scarcity itself into control. Different countries, different ideologies, but one shared formula: debt, jobs, propaganda, control. The fascist regimes didn't just rebuild their economies, they reprogrammed their citizens. They created a society where employment was loyalty, production was pride, and dissent was unemployment. Economic dependence became the soft weapon of dictatorship. By the end of the 1930s, the economic illusion had reached its peak. Unemployment was nearly gone. Production was booming. National pride had returned. On the surface, fascism looked like a cure for capitalism's chaos. But it wasn't a cure, it was a conversion. The invisible hand of the market had been replaced by the iron fist of the state. Every factory, farm, and wage packet had become part of a single centralized equation: obedience equals stability. This was the true genius of fascist economics. Not efficiency, but control. Dictators learned that fear can only hold power for so long, but dependency can last forever. The worker who depends on the state doesn't revolt. He votes or salutes for survival. The mechanics of the system were deceptively simple. First came jobs. No dictatorship survives long on ideology alone. So the regimes made employment a moral duty. Work makes you free, the Nazi slogan said, twisting labor into loyalty. The second lever was debt. Public works, military expansion, and subsidies gave the illusion of prosperity. But the money wasn't real. It was borrowed, printed, or hidden behind creative accounting. The third lever was propaganda. Every economic policy was dressed in the language of pride and destiny. The state wasn't buying your silence, it was buying your belief. Citizens didn't just see themselves as workers. They saw themselves as participants in a grand national project. They were rebuilding greatness. They were part of the story. And that's what made the control invisible. When you think you're building the future, you don't notice the chains on your hands. The Nazi economic miracle is often remembered as a success story. It shouldn't be. Yes, unemployment collapsed, but wages stagnated, prices rose, and workers lost their bargaining power. Independent unions were abolished. Strikes became treason. Real income fell. But propaganda told people they were richer. They had jobs, parades, cheap radios, vacations subsidized by the state, Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy. It was entertainment as anesthesia. In Mussolini's Italy, the same pattern held. The regime claimed to have united labor and capital under one patriotic banner. In reality, it replaced competition with quotas and choice with compliance. Every worker was part of a corporazione, a state-run guild where wages, hours, and duties were dictated from above. The market was dead. The corporation of the state had replaced it. And when war came, that machinery of obedience shifted seamlessly into overdrive. Workers didn't need to be convinced to produce weapons. They'd already been conditioned to see production itself as virtue. That's how you build an army before the first battle is declared, by turning the entire economy into one long assembly line of loyalty. But here's where the story becomes even more uncomfortable. Because the economics of control didn't die in 1945. They evolved. Modern governments learned the same lesson. You can buy stability with jobs and credit long before you ever need force. The methods changed, but the principle stayed. When unemployment rises, when unrest brews, the solution is always the same: massive public spending, infrastructure projects, stimulus packages, and patriotic branding. The message is familiar. Work is dignity. Buy local. Support the nation. No dictator required. Just a system that trades freedom for financial comfort, one paycheck at a time. Today, the relationship between governments and citizens looks less like partnership and more like payroll. The same dependence the fascists engineered through propaganda is now built through debt, subsidies, and credit. When your mortgage depends on interest rates, your savings depend on inflation, and your income depends on state-funded industries, how free are you really? You don't need censorship when compliance is profitable. All across the world, governments are rediscovering the old tools of economic control, wrapped in new packaging. When factories slow down, the state steps in with rescue packages. When growth stalls, central banks print money to fund jobs and subsidies. Citizens cheer because stability feels good. But just like the 1930s, it's not wealth being created, it's debt being recycled. Jobs are no longer expressions of freedom, they're extensions of policy. Entire industries now survive, not because they're competitive, but because they're politically useful. Defense, energy, surveillance, infrastructure. When the state becomes the employer, the investor, and the regulator, the economy stops being a system, it becomes a hierarchy. And hierarchies don't reward freedom, they reward obedience. That's what the fascist regimes understood, and what modern systems risk forgetting. You don't need to control speech if you control sustenance. You don't need to suppress rebellion if everyone's too indebted to risk it. The lesson of fascism's economics isn't just about history, it's about human behavior. People don't fall for dictators because they love tyranny. They fall for the illusion of safety. When economies collapse, people will trade anything for stability. Their savings, their rights, their voices. That's why fascism worked. It didn't sell ideology, it sold insurance, and the premium was freedom. The same emotional mechanism still powers the world's largest economies today. Governments promise protection from volatility. Markets expect rescue at every crash. Citizens demand jobs, not reform. Debt grows, productivity stalls, and the illusion of prosperity continues, as long as everyone believes. That belief is the invisible bond that holds the modern world together. Not gold, not oil, not even the dollar. Belief that the system will keep paying, that the state will keep printing, that someone somewhere is still in control. But history warns what happens when that belief breaks. When the state becomes the economy, and the economy becomes the state, there's no one left to tell the truth. The line between policy and propaganda disappears. The numbers stop reflecting reality. And sooner or later, the bills come due, just like they did in 1939. Fascism didn't start with violence, it started with budgets. It began with a promise that the government could end chaos through jobs and loans and public works, and for a time, it did. The trains ran, the factories hummed, the flags waved, until the money ran out, until the debt-fueled order demanded something new to consume: land, labor, nations. The final stage of fascist economics wasn't stability, it was expansion. When there was nothing left to borrow, the regimes borrowed lives. That's how economic control became global war. The warning is simple, but it never ages. When the promise of security becomes permanent policy, freedom becomes temporary. Every empire that bought loyalty with jobs eventually paid for it with blood. And every democracy that forgets how fascism funded itself risks repeating its methods, quietly, bureaucratically, debt by debt, paycheck by paycheck. Because economic control doesn't always march in uniform. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit, smiling, promising growth, and offering you a job. And by the time you realize what it cost, the freedom you traded is already gone. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.